Tell Us About Yourself is sponsored by bonusround.ca, streaming Canada's classic game shows on demand. Dive into the golden age of television with thousands of episodes of Canadian series that defined an era from anywhere in the world, all for just $1.99 a month. From iconic shows like Let's Make a Deal and Definition to cult classics like Bumper Stumpers and The Mad Dash, bonusround.ca brings you timeless entertainment that's fun, enlightening, and affordable. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, relive the magic of Canadian television history. Subscribe now at bonusround.ca for $1.99 and turn every night into game show night. And by The Inn at Leola Village. Nestled in the heart of picturesque Pennsylvania, the Inn at Leola Village is a sanctuary of luxury and relaxation. Indulge in the timeless beauty of their historic suites, each meticulously designed to transport you to a bygone era of elegance and grace. Experience the culinary delights of their award-winning Italian restaurant, where every dish is a masterpiece crafted from the finest local ingredients. From romantic getaways to corporate retreats, the Inn at Leola Village offers a haven for every occasion. Unwind at the spa, stroll through the lush gardens, and let the stress of everyday life melt away. Make your reservation today at theinnatleolavillage.com or call the front desk at area code 717-656-7002. The Inn at Leola Village, an oasis of luxury. Tell Us About Yourself, Conversations with Game Show Contestants is produced in partnership with the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York, one of the largest history museums in the United States, and one of the leading museums serving families with highly interactive exhibits and programs. Since 1968, the Strong Museum has been dedicated to exploring the ways in which play encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and how it illuminates cultural history. And their National Archives of Game Show History. Founded by industry veterans Bob Bowden and Howard Blumenthal, the archive is home to thousands of artifacts representing over 80 years of broadcasting, including props, set designs, video interviews with game show professionals, and other iconic elements from the history of television at play. For more information about the National Archives of Game Show History or the Strong National Museum of Play, visit museumofplay.org or call area code 585-263-2700.
Blue 35.
Tell us about yourself, would you?
Tell us something about you.
For any new viewers, why don't you tell us again about yourself?
We've met before, but let's meet again. Tell us about yourself.
What else can you tell us about yourself?
Perhaps you'd fill us in again and tell us about yourself.
I'm Christian Carrion. For me, one of the true joys that has come about as a result of hosting this podcast is the privilege of hearing stories from my favorite era in game shows, the mid to late 70s. With that in mind, you can imagine my delight when speaking with tonight's guest, Shelley Herman, former dating game bachelorette, Now You See It champion, employee at NBC Studios in Burbank, and author of the entertaining new book, My Peacock Tale, Secrets of An NBC Page. Shelley was present for the development and subsequent flourish of mid-70s television, such an exciting and romantic time to be in that industry. And as you'll hear, from writing the clues on Supermarket Sweep to picking up Chuck Woolery for work in the midst of a rough morning to say the least, Shelley Herman, proud as a peacock of her fabled days as an attendant to the stars, has no shortage of fascinating stories. Shelley, welcome to the show. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, my name is Shelley Herman. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I'm an author. The first game show I was on was 1972, while I was still a high school student, and I was on the original dating game with Jim Lang. And that was the daytime version. And I was asked back in 1973 to be a bachelorette on the syndicated version, also with Jim Lang. And then a few years later, I was a game show contestant on the Jack Nars version of Now You See It. But I've done like a bajillion game show run-throughs, and was, I think the last game show run-through I did was for a show called Trump Card. And yes, it was that Trump. And it basically, the show was bingo, but instead of the word bingo, it was the word Trump.
Naturally.
Of course. He put his name on everything.
That's right. I remember that show very well. That's like one of the first shows I remember seeing as like a kid. I just remember like it was very gold, glitzy sort of set, if I remember correctly.
It was very glitzy. We shot it at NBC in Burbank, although I wasn't working there at the time as an employee. I was brought in by Fred Wasbrock, who has his own place in game show history, but he said, "Do you want to come in and do this run through?" And the only thing I knew about Donald Trump at the time was he was a real estate guy, and he had put a bunch of money toward restoring an ice skating rink in Central Park. So I was like really curious to check out this guy when he showed up, and see what kind of a mover and a shaker he was. And I formed an opinion.
Understood.
It's all in the book.
Sure.
But, I think I was on to him before some other people were.
Yeah, I think you were probably not alone in that, especially at that point in his career.
Yeah, but I'm glad I got to meet him.
Sure. Shelley, one of the questions I typically start these interviews with, the question that I start these interviews with, I always love to know what role game shows played in the contestant's life before they became a contestant. So growing up, when you were young, and all of us are very impressionable and fascinated with TV and watching TV, what did game shows in particular mean to you, if anything?
Oh my gosh. I didn't know they meant something to me until much later, when I was actually in college and had to really kind of think about it, because growing up, I was fortunate to see the game shows that featured Arlene Francis and Kitty Carlisle and Dorothy Kilgallen, Peggy Cass, Bess Meyerson, Betsy Palmer, Jane Meadows. And of course, I was attracted to those shows. And then I realized later on, I think part of the reason I liked them so much is I was seeing women who were dressed very beautifully, who weren't just prize models. They were sitting on the panels with these men, and they were playing on a level playing field. And they were as witty and as smart and as funny as the guys were. And that's kind of the first time I saw women who weren't just playing housewives on TV or teachers or somebody's bumbling assistant. So I think I was attracted to that element of seeing women who were holding their own that way.
That is an element of those like panel shows of the 50s that I think in discussion these days tends to get overlooked. The idea that women on television at that time were, like you say, the models. They were they didn't have speaking roles. They weren't allowed to be funny or, upstage to the host. But people like Arlene Francis and Peggy Cass, who is one of my personal favorites. I think she's such a badass, and she plays To Tell the Truth so incredibly well, and she's so quick and knowledgeable about so many different subjects. But yeah, people like that, women like that in particular, I think tend to get overlooked when we look back at that era of TV. But yeah, it's a definite paradigm shift from where women were on television at that time, I think.
Well, Arlene Francis actually did get a shot at hosting a game show when television was in its infancy.
Right.
But to hear her tell it, my friend Susan Stafford, who was on Wheel of Fortune when Chuck Woolery was hosting it. She was the first woman host to be handed a microphone and given an opportunity to speak, and was nominated for an Emmy as co-host of Wheel of Fortune.
Susan Stafford filled that role so differently than Vanna White does these days. I mean, I think they both do a wonderful job, but Susan Stafford in particular, I love the energy that she brought to that show.
She brought a common touch and a humanity and an accessibility to Wheel. It was a different era too, because remember with Wheel, the original show was kind of like a shopping bazaar where people took time to buy prizes with the money they'd earned. So there was a little more chance for her to put her personality into the show by prize modeling as well as flipping the letters. And people started liking Susan and wanted to know more about her. And that's why she took on a bigger role with the show. And she was smart and funny and articulate. And I'm speaking of her in the past only because that was her former job. She's still very, very much a vital and active woman now living in Las Vegas.
Oh, good for her. I'm glad to hear she's doing well.
Oh yeah.
That's wonderful.
Susan will always do well.
Good. I love it. And if you ever talk to her, just tell her a person who enjoyed her time at Wheel of Fortune says hello.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So going back to that era of television, you talked about all the panelists on these shows in the 50s and 60s. What's My Line, To Tell the Truth, I've Got a Secret, that sort of stable of shows that are classics. And I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but as somebody who has had so much experience in the world of television, I wonder if you have any insight into this. I wonder if a show like, we'll say, What's My Line? I wonder if a show like that will ever happen again. Will that ever happen again? Now that there are things like podcasts where people are entertained by just two humans talking to each other. Is there room for that kind of entertainment in the landscape these days? I wonder if you have any insight into that.
Gosh, I hope there's not only room for it. We know that these different game show trends are cyclical. And I think it's time again to see a show where women and men do kind of dress up and act smart and really play a game. And they're not just worried about hogging up camera time and being silly and raucous. I mean, I'll probably get in trouble for this, but I'll say it anyway. I loved the original version of To Tell the Truth. And I liked to play along. In the latest version of that show, people spent too much time being silly amongst themselves and not playing the game. So
100% agree.
I would like to see people play games again. I mean, the whole idea of a good game is if you're walking through the room on your way to the bathroom and somebody asks a question, you stick around another 30 seconds for the answer before you go to the bathroom. And that's what To Tell the Truth was. You see these three people lined up, you kind of form a visceral opinion about them, but you got to stick around and find out if you're right.
Sure. Well, I also think that one of the things the older version of To Tell the Truth, and I'll use the 60s, 70s version as my frame of reference because I grew up watching those reruns, a lot of them on Game Show Network when I was younger. But you had panelists like Bill Cullen, like Joe Garagiola, all these people who were, they were funny, but they were there to play the game first, and they weren't afraid to let their breadth of knowledge sort of shine. It was cool to be smart on TV back then. I think you're right in that this newer version, there's a lot of, opportunities to get a good one-liner in and, something clippable and shareable, like most TV these days. But yeah, back then it was just such a different game.
Well, I think it became acceptable to flaunt your ignorance and that somehow that was going to help the contestant. I've seen that in several incarnations of classic shows. And that's why I think if they just went back to playing a straightforward game, it doesn't have to be a lot of lights and shiny floors. It just has to be a game that works.
Right. That's the first word in game show is game.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Shelley, tell me about, if you remember, tell me about when you decided you wanted to become a game show contestant. Was the dating game your first opportunity to participate in that process?
Yes, several of my friends from Agora High School went on the dating game. So then suddenly the idea that that was a possibility became a possibility, because I had really never thought of being on camera. I mean, I was a theater geek and all that stuff, but when I saw my friends go on the show and they got to go on free vacations, hello, I was all in favor of that. And what's funny is the first dating game I did, we went down to San Diego, which is only maybe a 2-hour drive from where I live, but it was still a wonderful adventure. And I'll backtrack a little bit with this. The chaperone I had on the first dating game trip looked like Cher from when Cher was doing the Sonny and Cher show. Black hair all the way down her back. She wore midriff blouses. She was thin. She had the long fingernails. She was hot. And whenever we were going around with the dating game thing, and because San Diego's a town filled with sailors, she attracted a lot of attention.
Sure.
Just last week, I went to the home of Vince Longo. Vince was a photographer for Chuck Barris. And in my book, I have pictures that Vince took of me on the Gong Show. I was brought up for a silly bit at the beginning. And I had called Vince on the phone and go, oh my gosh, it's been 40 some odd years. We should talk. And he goes, yeah, let's talk quick. I'm moving out of the state in 2 weeks. So I went to Vince's house. Another guy there by the name of Ed joined us. And it turns out his sister was the woman who was my chaperone on the dating game.
What a small world. How incredible was that? Yeah,
because that was what was cool about the Barris organization. It was a family and they took care of their own. And if somebody's friend wanted to be a chaperone, great, let's do, for me, when you're a female under 21, the chaperone had to be female. And I was 17 and 18 the 2 times that I won my vacations. So I had this really hot girl the first time. And on my second trip, I got to go to the Bahamas. And when I won my trip, I hugged my bachelor and whispered in his ear, where are the Bahamas? I had no idea where I was going, but I got to go somewhere.
Oh, how wonderful. That's excellent.
And I was on the same show that night as Susan Strasberg. So that was pretty cool to get to meet her. And both of us got identical ship and shore blouses, so we could be twins.
Oh, fantastic.
So I won that trip, got to do that, and a bicycle. So that was cool too. I still have the bicycle. But the truth is, once those dating game experiences were over, Vince and I became friends. He actually took me to see the Rocky Horror Show at the Roxy Theater with Tim Curry live. So that was a cool date.
My wife would be boiling over with jealousy. That is her favorite. Oh yeah, her favorite movie. We just saw it. We saw it a couple nights ago. Actually, on Friday the 13th, we went to go see it.
Oh no, it was in person. In person, it wasn't quite as dark. It was just a lot of fun. And of course, I was underage at the Roxy and wearing hot pants and teasing my hair, trying to get drinks, but they didn't care.
Sure.
So that was fun. But the fact that here Vince and I had dated, even though I didn't win him on the dating game, we dated and I hung around the Barris people. We did run-throughs together. Chuck treated me like I was one of his, kids. It was the most creative, encouraging atmosphere I've ever been in any production company.
Oh, I love it. I am going to focus on Chuck Barris for a second because I have a personal fascination with him and his work and the way that his organization worked. And I'll kind of relate it to another realm of interest here, but hearing about the way the Chuck Barris organization worked, how they created shows, how they fleshed out shows, reminds me of what I would hear about Atari in the 70s, Apple in the 80s, these sort of Google in the 90s, these sort of freewheeling, very kind of open and fun and just carefree environments that gave way to this like incredible creativity. I wonder what you can tell me about being present for that energy, for that creative energy.
There was always good food. So that's the first thing. Chuck would treat his staff really, really well. And nurturing that vibe made people not only work hard, but want to work hard. And the times I was involved with doing run-throughs was always hands-on involved in the process. And he welcomed other people's thoughts on how to tweak a game a certain way. Keeping in mind, at one time, Chuck Barris had 27 hours of television on a week.
Amazing.
He's the only person who had television shows on CBS, ABC, NBC, and in syndication all at the same time. So the fact that he would even ask other people's opinions, I thought was pretty amazing, because it seemed like he knew some kind of secret sauce to put on these game shows that other people didn't know.
Right.
It was a party, but then when it was time to get down to work, yeah, we all focused, we all did our thing. And as zany and goofy and wonderful as everybody thinks it was there, I never saw drug use. That people smoked cigarettes, and I'm sure people were like, partying in the parking lot, but it was people being very responsible, trying to do good television.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. Yeah, I love Chuck Barris, and I love his productions, and I just love the way he approached that type of TV. I know that, and I've learned this from talking to some producers, talking to some contestants who've participated in run-throughs, that for every decent idea a game show producer has that makes the air, there are like 3 crazy, out there, insane, this will never happen types of ideas. Have you been present for any of those crazy, out there, sort of Chuck Barris ideas that a casual game show fan might not have heard of, that kind of sticks in your mind?
I always heard about a pitch that I think it either came from Chuck Barris or Ralph Andrews about killing your mother-in-law. And I don't quite, and something about the bonus round might have had like a shooting gallery, and the mother-in-law had to dodge things and not get shot to win.
Oh my God.
That one, I can't remember if it was Chuck or Ralph Andrews, but
that was Chuck. That's a Chuck idea.
Well, I don't know exactly, but
sure.
That's probably the craziest one. But I've also worked on some shows with Jeff Edwards and Mark Maxwell Smith. They had a really good show, and I don't know why it never went. So there's both sides of the coin, that, again, because things are cyclical, maybe it just wasn't the right time for that show. And then I've worked on shows where, let's take a little bit from this run through and add a little bit of that. And I mean, I can tell you, I did one of the first run throughs for Family Feud before it was what we know to be Family Feud now. And it wasn't good. And a lot of it has to do with, and I know some people are going to go, huh? But it has to do with the writing. Because if you aren't intrigued by the questions, or in the case of Jeopardy, the answers, you're not going to stick around. No matter, how many, flashy things are going on there. So I don't think Feud had dialed into what it eventually became.
Right. I had heard that early on it was almost like the old Match Game question, like from the 60s, before they got sort of salacious. It was, name something about a duck, or, name a kind of pudding, exciting questions like that. Right.
So it wasn't quite fun. And of course they wanted kind of what I thought was intriguing about it is they wanted multi-generational families. And I liked that aspect of it. I remember saying at the run through, I thought that was fun. But no, the rest of it wasn't.
That's funny. That's a time in the sort of production history of Goodson and Todman where they were really experimenting with a lot of different things. I mean, the idea that there would be 2 teams of 5 contestants on set at the same time, all of them was if I'm not mistaken, that's a pretty big game changer. I mean, it's sort of unprecedented in terms of that kind of TV. They were doing things like The Better Sex, where there were 2 hosts and, a team of 5 on each side, but there were, a man and a woman handling the hosting duties together. They were really
do you remember a game show when I first got to NBC as a page? I only was there for like 2 or 3 weeks because the show had been canceled. A show called Fun Factory.
Oh, with Bobby Van.
Yes.
Yep.
And talk about your crazy game shows. I mean, here's a guy that would come out singing, and they'd have improv sketch performers in the middle of the game and going into the audience and doing things. And it was just all over the place.
Unbelievable. And when you're first becoming a page, I mean, seeing things like that, I read your book, and I'll say it. I said it before we started recording, but I'll say it now. I loved your book. Arriving to NBC, of course, arriving to NBC and seeing all these things in person just had to have felt like the fulfillment of some cosmic duty, some kind of dream. You had to have felt incredible seeing all this in person for the first time.
Well, it was like, instead of Alice in Wonderland, it was Shelley through the cathode tube, because we were just kind of thrust into the job. Usually first of all, I was underage to be a page at the time, but because the NABIT strike had just been resolved, they quick needed a bunch of people because it was tourist season. And as you can tell, I'm not very shy about speaking. So I was able to jump right into giving the tours. I have a very good memory. So even though they didn't give us much information about NBC history, I had studied up before my interview. So I could drop, Arturo Toscanini type of names to them and they would think I was smart. But once I was there, I just decided that I was just going to be a little sponge and just soak up everything I could and just try to learn all the different aspects of television, not just the creative end, but the business end and the press and publicity end, and how to deal with the public, which was a big part of the job, especially for the first couple of months as an NBC page, because we would be ushering the shows and giving the tours. And then once we got a little seniority, then we were interacting more with the executives and the talent, doing limo runs to the airport, escorting celebrities to different press events, the Rose Bowl, the Emmy Awards, things like that. So by the time those really plum assignments came up, I was still starstruck. Who am I kidding?
Of course. Oh God, how could you not be? How could you not be? It's just such an incredible era to be part of. And, in terms of television, I think, and I speak from the point of reference of game shows in particular, but to me, the 70s is just such a golden era of television, just so experimental and fun and colorful. And just to see all that in person, I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Well, I saw shows that never made it on the air. That's how experimental it was, because I was there through several different presidents at NBC, eventually Fred Silverman arriving. But there was a show that David Brenner starred in called Snip, and he was playing a gay hairdresser. Leslie Ann Warren was also in it. And I saw a couple of those episodes taped, and ooh, that was too much for people to handle back then. Ooh.
Oh, I bet it was.
And now if you put the show on the air, David Brenner wouldn't have been able to do it, aside from being dead, but he wouldn't have been able to do it because he's not a gay man. And they probably would have been looking to cast somebody gay for the role.
Right. Representation. Sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to backtrack for just a second here, Shelley. Let's go back to the dating game for a second. And I talked about Chuck Barris for a minute, and we talked about the dating game, but the contestant selection process for the dating game, to me, has this sort of mythical quality surrounding it. What do you remember about the process by which you were selected to be on the dating game?
Thank you for asking, because it's a very vivid memory. At the time, the studio and the office space was at 1313 North Vine Street. And on the side of the building, there were some steep steps to walk up. And it was a very hot day. I remember that. And I was trying to, look like I was a sophisticated woman. And I think I was wearing a halter top, but nevertheless, I was trying to dress up and look older than I was. And they sat us in a room with all the girls on one side of a partition and all the guys on the other. And the guys were given questions to ask the girls. And we would just kind of round robin it to see how they delivered the material that they were given. And then we switched it off. And then the girls asked the questions, and then the guys answer the questions. But there were probably, I would think, 10 girls on one side, 10 guys on the other side. And then the people that were the casting people, I think Ruthie Goldberg was there at the time. They would, have a little chart to see, who was telegenic, who could speak properly, things like that. And it was a matter of like maybe 2 weeks. And I got the call that, hey, we want you. So I went back down to Vine Street and met with a guy named Ron Kavakis, who he and Mike Metzger, we were in a room together, and they were like, okay, tell us something about yourself. And I'm a high school student. I didn't have much of a life going on, but one of my part-time jobs I had is I was a salad bar hostess at a restaurant. And I remember the first question that they wrote for me to ask the bachelors was, I'm a salad bar hostess, so what kind of vegetable would you be in my salad? Which is so dumb. But these poor guys just had to mine any kind of original, information out of us little tweens, trying to figure out, something entertaining. And there was a soundproof booth. It was like a little portable dressing room, and they put headsets on us, so we could not hear the bachelor introductions at all. And basically they said, somebody came, took your headsets off, walked you right out onto the stage where Jim Lang would introduce us. And you go from being, in a dark little room, and all of a sudden all the bright lights when you step out there. So that was fun. Oh, I'm going to tell you a story I've never told anybody else.
I can't wait. Let's go.
Second time I did dating game. I was like a little hippie chick, and I wore a silver POW bracelet, which was, it was like a cuff bracelet. And back in the early 70s, when some of the soldiers who'd gone to Vietnam had gone missing in action, there was an organization that printed these cuff bracelets. And my guy's name was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Naughton. And I wore this bracelet religiously, hoping one day that he would be found safe and come home. So by the time I did my second dating game, he was one of the guys in March of 73 that came home, that got off the airplane. And I saw him get off the airplane, and I was so excited. So the second time I did dating game, I figured out where this guy lived. And, back then you could look in a phone book and everybody was listed. And I wrote him a letter, and I said, I'm going to be on the dating game, and I'm going to put my silver bracelet back on so you can see me wear it on television and know that I'm thinking of you. And he wrote me back, and he said, please don't put the bracelet back on again. That'll be just fine. I'll know you're thinking of me. So I wrote him back, and I said I would pull my ear like Carol Burnett and let him know I was thinking of him. And that's what I did.
Oh, how wonderful is that?
I should have put that in the book. I forgot
You
that.
should have put, that's a good one. You should have put that in the damn book. Yeah.
Yeah. Sequel.
That's right. That's right. My second Peacock Tale.
Yes, more feathers.
That's right. Yeah. I love it. Wow, what a wonderful story. Yeah, the dating game is just one of those shows that it's the process by which these people were selected. I was always curious about that.
Well, sometimes I can tell you this because there's a very famous clip that they run on these, blooper kind of shows of the dating game where there's a woman wearing a very sexy red dress, kind of leaning on the back of the chair, and she asks the bachelor, "How do you spell relief?"
Right.
And that used to be the Rolaids ad.
Right.
Well, it turns out that's a girl, Kim Fowler, that I went to high school with. So I knew Kimmy. So then the person who answered that question said FART. So back in 72, 73, I mean, that was like scandalous, but
Sure.
very funny. So it turns out I later met Nicholas Schaefer, the guy that said that line. And he was a member of the performing union AFTRA. So he was hired several times to be on the dating game because he always could provide silly answers for things. So part of the casting process was civilians off the street. Sometimes it was people, I think at the time he had been in the Groundlings group, and they brought him in specifically almost as like a ringer so that they would get funny answers out of him.
Right. Well, that probably also explains why and how people like Andy Kaufman got on the dating game.
Well, so, and sometimes their publicists would say, go on there, it's good promotion for you. The same way that Chuck would do the Gong Show. He would, if somebody has all of the tapes of the Gong Show, they'll see Paul Rubens on there several times before he became Pee Wee Herman, doing different shtick. And, a lot of people would say like, hey, Chuck, I need money for my health insurance. Can you put me on? And they'd come up with some bit and they'd get a few bucks, and they'd get their health insurance for the year.
The illusion of television, right? Because to people watching, it's just a cross section of people from all over, wherever, going on and doing its thing. But right, it's just however you can get people on the show, I guess, right?
I'll tell you another secret.
I love secrets.
Okay, Fred Wasbrock, as I mentioned earlier, was a very, very dear friend of mine. And people that know game shows know his encyclopedia of game show books that he's done and trivia books. And he's since sadly passed away.
Right.
But as an agent, one of his clients was Adam West, the iconic Batman.
Sure.
And Adam was on the celebrity version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And I was a little nervous about him anyway, because sometimes Adam is a bit goofy about things and doesn't always focus in on what needs to be done. So they're doing the fastest finger round, and Adam's finger wasn't very fast. And when they did finally get to Adam, he did wind up winning $250,000 for his charity, which was a library up in Idaho where he lived. And I was actually one of his lifelines. I was on standby for that show, so that was kind of exciting too. But Fred had said to Adam, why couldn't you do this faster? You're obviously an intelligent man. You could have been out of here sooner. And he said every day that he was on Millionaire, he got paid union scale. So while other people did one day, I think Adam got like 3 or 4 days out of it. So he got paid for it in addition to giving money to charity.
Hey, good for him. Playing the long game.
There you go. So
that's
he was
wonderful.
Very smart.
That is wonderful. Shelley, you are one of the few people that I've talked to for this podcast, maybe the first one, who has ever met Jack Nars. And you were on Now You See It, one of his shows in the early 70s, the big word search game.
Yeah, that was fun. I was on for a couple days with that. And unfortunately, I was up against, now see, here's where my memory kicks in again. There was a contestant named Carly Katie and she was the Ken Jennings of Now You See It, and she just tore through people, like a bandsaw. So I didn't stand a chance of winning with her. I did get a Tappan microwave at the time, and my mother, I was living at home, and my mother's like, "Get that hideous thing out of my kitchen," and I had it on the dresser in my bedroom, and I kept it until I moved out into my own apartment.
Oh, how wonderful. That's why, yeah, they don't make microwaves like that anymore.
Or studio apartments, because this thing was huge.
Oh, that too, right.
Yeah, I've lived in things smaller than that Tappan oven.
Tell me, Shelley, what you remember about Jack Nars in person. He's one of my favorite of that era of host. I thought he was just so welcoming and so just kind of gregarious and fun. What do you remember about Jack Nars?
He was very cordial and very knowledgeable. And he's one of these guys, I would almost call him like the Bing Crosby of game show hosts, because he had a laid back quality to him, and I didn't feel intimidated at all playing the game. He made it a really comfortable experience, and did when I became a loser, I do remember he came over and shook my hand and thanked me for playing the game off camera. I mean, he was a genuinely nice guy.
I'm so glad that the way he is on screen comes across off screen, because I'm sure that you have your fair share of experiences involving people who seem one way on camera and are completely different off camera.
Yes. Let's just say that the reason there are game show writers is because some of these people who host the shows need to have everything scripted for them, because they aren't the sharpest tools in the shed all the time.
Oh, come on, name one. Just name one. Just one. Just one.
I'm not going to name any of them, but it's also kind of fun when you see somebody who you think has it all together, and then when they go up and they flub, they'd go back and edit things back in the old days. But if it's so fun to see people mess up, and especially with the hosts. I think that's part of the enjoyment also. I mean, I wrote a show called Liars Club. And
love Liars Club.
Thank you. I
Absolutely.
love that show too.
Yes.
I would like that show to come back.
That would be a great one to come back. Absolutely. What a great game that was.
But one of the important things, and they did this with Alan Ludden at Password too, Alan was never supposed to know what the passwords were. And in the case of Liars Club, which for the people that haven't seen that show, it was a panel show that had 4 celebrities and 2 contestants. Each of the celebrities would tell a different story about a unique item, and it was up to the contestants to figure out which celebrity had been telling the truth, what the item actually was. And we could never tell Alan what it would be, because in his ad-libbing, he could inadvertently slip up and say, oh, that looks like a pretty Tibetan prayer wheel, or something like, oh, there goes that prop.
Right.
So whenever Alan would come by the offices, we had these black duvetine pieces of fabric, and we would just throw them over all of the things, so that if Alan came through, he would never see any of the props that we had there.
Well, that preserves a bit of the play along aspect too. It is fun to see the host kind of play along with the celebrities, with the contestants.
Well, and then it's on the flip side of that, you had somebody like Alex Trebek, who would read every question, learn every pronunciation, try to get everything right the first time, not to make himself look intelligent, but because he wanted to keep the pace of the game going too. He was very, very professional that way. So you had kind of both ends of the spectrum there of not telling hosts things, and then other hosts knowing everything.
So, Shelley, you mentioned something that has come up in a lot of these recent conversations that I've had with contestants. I miss when things would go wrong on TV and they would leave it in. That, to me, is a huge part of the charm of the game shows of the 70s and like early 80s. And The Price is Right continued that, I think, like into the 90s and things, because up until Bob Barker retired, they didn't do too much editing of that show. Isn't there something that's taken away from a game show when it's so edited and it's so manicured, and they're seemingly afraid to show those very human mistakes?
I agree with you 100%. The only time I would say they should edit is if, of course, if there's a mistake made in delivering a question, or if they found an answer. When you were doing a game show, there's judges that are sitting there, and if the contestant comes up with an answer that maybe that guy's right also, and then during the commercial break they'll look it up and go, yeah, it could be one or the other. So we have to either burn the question or give the contestants equal credit for their answers, or if monies were taken away from them. I really feel like one of the problems with television these days is because it is so homogenized. And I think the reason that network TV does as well as it does is because when they do live sporting events or Saturday Night Live, because you're really there, you've invested emotionally in what you're seeing, so that when there is something that screws up or if somebody gets hurt, you're there, you're watching it. I know American Ninja Warrior is taped ahead of time, but that's one of my guilty pleasure shows, because the way that they do it looks like it's a live show, and you do get drawn into it that way. So yes, having people be spontaneous and raucous, as long as it's not at the expense of the contestant, I think is something that I'd like to see more often in game shows.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and going back to something that we talked about earlier, that idea that celebrities, panelists, the partners in the game were there to help the contestant win, and not so much, they were there for the exposure, but that wasn't the primary reason they were playing the game. They were playing to win, and they were, competitive on the part of the contestant, which is something that happens today to a certain degree, but I don't think it's anywhere near as important to today's celebrities as it was to the ones back then.
Well, but also, didn't you get kind of excited when you'd watch a show like Password and you saw Betty White was going to be on?
Oh, yeah.
Or Carol Burnett or Lucy, and you go, ooh, these are smart, clever people. I want to see how they do the show.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
It wasn't them just being silly about it. They were emotionally invested. That's the reason why people went to Richard Dawson so much on Match Game. He genuinely wanted these people to win.
Oh yeah. Oh, and he was so good at it. And the other example of that comes to mind, which I think is one of the ultimate examples, is Pyramid. When you see the two celebrities that are playing for the week, you can tell it's going to be a hell of a week, or you can tell it's kind of going to be a dud because these celebrities aren't that good at it.
Well, I'll tell you this too, is back in the old days, when Pyramid was running as a daily strip of a show, there was a guy by the name of David Michaels who it would be mandatory that the celebrities would have to come to the offices of Bob Stewart Productions if it was the first time they were playing Pyramid. And David would play the game with these people to make sure they understood all the nuances of the game and that they were familiar with strategy, so that when they got to the studio, they were primed for it. They weren't just like, well, I'll watch the show at home and for 10 minutes and try to figure it out. And I think that's something that's really crucial, especially when you have the celebrities on, because the celebrities are trying to be funny and witty, but they have to know to lock into the game when the time comes to start playing.
Right. And it makes not only for a good experience for the contestant, but it just makes for good TV overall. Nobody wants to see somebody, bubbling around playing a game that they don't know the first thing about.
And conversely, I'm sure there were times when celebrities were presented to Pyramid and brought into their offices and they didn't cut the muster. So I'm sure that a lot of bad players were eliminated that way as well.
Shelley, one of the aspects of game shows that I find casual game show fans are surprised by is the idea that there are run-throughs, there are pilots, there are test shows, there are writers, and there are rehearsals, and all these things that go into what seems like a spontaneous half hour of TV, but it's so rehearsed and it's so practiced so that it comes across smoothly on television. I would love to know anything you remember about any of the run-throughs that you participated in during your time in California in the 70s. Any of those game shows that maybe made it to air, maybe didn't, but that process, anything you remember. I'm fascinated by it.
There was a show that Ralph Andrews sold, 50 Grand Slam. And it was the first show that was using computers. And boy, did they break a lot. and it was very costly production wise to try to come into the new generation of electronics on these shows. And there were a lot of stop downs, and I remember, and it did get you weary with all of that. I remember doing another run through where we were presenting it to the network, and the celebrities were sitting in chairs behind a podium. And if they got the answer wrong, it was on some kind of a hydraulic system, and the celebrities would go down so that they'd be hiding behind their podiums so that you couldn't see them anymore to choose them as somebody to play with. Well, that didn't work real well.
I can imagine. Oh my God, what a nightmare.
And of course, are you supposed to get very flamboyant people just to sit there underneath the podium while the rest of the game is being played? They'd all want to like stick their heads out and goof off, and they didn't want to be stuck in podium prison. So yeah, there's concepts that didn't work. There was one that I didn't work on it, but I was watching it. I can't even remember what show it was, but I remember during the run through that they were shooting people with paintball guns. And I guess they didn't realize how much that hurt. And they stopped it, or they then made them wear a thicker protective vest or face shield or something. But I was working on Balderdash over at KTLA, and it was being somebody was taping it at that time. And no, people got hurt. Yeah, it was bad.
And when you say Balderdash, you mean the one that was on PAX, like the early 2000s?
Yeah, with Elaine Boozler.
Right.
Female host. Hello.
That's right. Absolutely. Were you one of the writers who constructed those sort of poems that the contestant would have to finish with the brand name before they went out and found it on the shelf?
Oh, we would do that for the bonus game. The front game was a little bit different of a dynamic, and again, something that I have rarely mentioned before. But when I was working on Supermarket Sweep, we had a contractual obligation to do product placement for the items that were in the store. There's a company that was ConAgra, and they gave somebody a bunch of money to say, we need 30% of your content to feature ConAgra products. So we couldn't just write all the silly little questions we wanted to. We had to think of different ways to write wishbone salad dressing things because of the contractual obligation. Yes, as far as the end game, the sweep itself, we would write those, and they'd be written in such a way that maybe the first one or two were pretty easy to get. Maybe the third one was a little harder to get because, that would be the big win. I wrote them, and then the sweeps themselves were not done live in the studio as you saw them on the air. They were edited down to maybe a minute 50, 2 minutes long. And I would write the copy to the sweeps. And Al Howard, who owned the show, had some very specific phrases that he wanted to be said. She went down for what is that, Bertolli olive oil, and came up with, he had little certain up and down, in and out, side to side. He had certain ways he wanted things written. And another secret about Supermarket Sweep: when people ran to go get the meat products and the hams and the turkeys and the steaks and things like that, all of those were fake resin molds that were made of the food. But everything else in the supermarket was real food. Why, you ask? Because when they originally did Supermarket Sweep, when only the men could push the shopping carts, not the women, they found that when people were picking up the meats and the hams and the turkeys and stuff, that all of the juices were getting on the people's clothing. And especially under the hot lights back in the day, it got real smelly real fast in the studio.
I bet. Ugh.
So Al Howard, very, very smart man, went down to Mexico and had dye molds made of the different types of meats and poultries and things like that, so that we could reuse it year after year after year. So it might have cost him a lot of money up front, but in the long run, it saved him a lot of money. And then after the sweeps were edited, to get back to that, Randy West would go into a post-production facility, and he might record 5 or 10 of those sweeps a day. And I would write the scripts, and he would read them to time, so that he went down for something, came up with it, and Randy would have to look at the screen as well as the copy. So because Randy's very adept at this sort of thing, it went very quickly. He was very good at it.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of talking to Randy a few months ago about his role as announcer in Supermarket Sweep, and his voice is one of those that just reminds me of my childhood. I even told him it was 5:30, dinner was cooking, I could smell it, and Supermarket Sweep was on the TV. It's just one of those shows.
Well, listen, doll, if you ever get out to LA, or remind me when I meet you at the Game Show Museum, I have the blooper reel from Supermarket Sweep.
Oh, I can't wait. Oh,
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
Let's just say it's not suitable for broadcast.
Shelley, do not tell me with a good time. I love it. I will remind you for sure. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
You've written for a lot of shows, and the material varies. I mean, from Balderdash to Liars Club to, well, anything else that there is in between. What's your creative process like when you set about writing for a game show?
First of all, I'm always really happy. So that goes a long way too. I think it depends on the format. A lot of times production companies put writers on a quota of having to deliver a certain amount of questions a day. And you can't just write questions, like, who is the first president of the United States? Because it's boring. So what I look for is what I would call the water cooler nugget in a question. Something that would make you want to say something to your friend at work the next day. Something that you'd want to, win a bar bet with. So in writing a question, and also in some instances, you're constrained by the amount of characters that you can have in a written display. Like on Jeopardy, there's only so many characters that you can put into the little box with the answer in it.
Sure.
So sometimes your creativity has to come down to, editing also. So that's the way I approach it. I'm not someone who likes to do a lot of puns, because I think that when somebody's trying to answer a question, it needs to be more straightforward and not proving how witty and clever you are as a writer, twisting your tongue around a certain question. I don't mind if it's punny in like in Pyramid or Win Ben Stein's Money, they would have cute little puns where you had to try to guess what was behind them. Like, is it going to be about a blood moon or vampires? You had to figure out what it was going to be.
Right.
So I like that. That's entertaining. I'll tell you another thing I didn't put in the book. There was a show that I was hired to write for that William Shatner was hosting. And I was brought in at the last minute because ABC said, quick, we need to do these shows. And it was double scale, but it was also like working 18-hour days in a room packed with a whole bunch of writers. And I wish I could remember the show, but it had to be like, they put a word up, and like the word house, and you would say like, house party was originally starring which person, house mortgage thing, and it had to be 3 different questions about house, but it had to start with the word house. Well, this was a really, really hard show to write.
Right.
And we were on a deadline. Do you remember the show?
ABC, William Shatner. Show Me the Money is the one that I remember. It. Yeah.
Yeah. We said something with a dirtier word starting that with a B, that we called the show. And we got the show ready. And we got called into a meeting. We were at CBS Radford, and we were certain it was going to be that meeting where the producers were going to thank us and had pizza and maybe pop some champagne corks because we got this done. And they said, ABC just canceled the show.
Oh my God.
And they had contestants flying in on airplanes. They had the set built. They'd already rigged the lights. They were going to tape the next day, and it was done.
I think I remember that because I had an online friend who was a contestant on Show Me the Money, and he won a big amount of money. He won a lot of money, and his episode never aired, and it was sort of like in limbo whether he was going to get paid or not because it was dependent on whether the show aired that he got his money. And I think it went on for a while, that little bit of drama about whether he was going to get paid for that show or not.
That was actually kind of the precedent-setting show because when I first started with game shows, there used to be a rule about you would only get paid if your show aired, and I think it was either like 90 or 100 days after the show was aired, which was a really convenient out for not paying contestants. And so that rule changed. So I think Show Me the Money was part of that change.
During the era of the game shows of the 70s, early 80s, were there as many rules regarding number of appearances as there are now? There are sort of seasons and off seasons for me. When I want to get on a show, I sort of have to, depending on the show, I have to like wait a year, or, sometimes they don't care if I've been on a show in the past. Sometimes you want people that have never been on TV before. Were there as stringent rules back then for that kind of thing?
The rule when I was there was 3 shows in 10 years. And because you're not just confined to the network's rules anymore, if you would do a show on GSN, I don't think they have the same rule. In fact, they actually encourage people who have been on game shows to do them again. One, because they've already kind of vetted them and know that they're a good contestant. But also, I think they like the idea of people having a certain familiarity with the contestants. So no, I don't think it is as hard and fast as it was before.
Yeah, and again, I think these days it does depend on the show. I went to try out for Password, where they were doing the new one on NBC just a year or two ago.
The Jimmy Fallon version?
Yeah, the Jimmy Fallon one. Yeah, I really wanted to try out because Password is a game that means a lot to me, and I have a lot of experience. I love Password. And so I wanted to get on the show, but they specifically wanted people who had never been on TV before to be on Password. I was so disappointed by that.
Well, during the pandemic, Adam Nedeff, who's very, very much involved with the museum.
Right.
Bob Bowden, also very much involved. Randy West, who has donated some fabulous items to the museum.
Yes, been a guest on this show as well.
Kathy Dawson, who had been one of the executive producers of the Family Feud version with Richard Dawson. And me and a few of our friends would play Password on Zoom every Sunday night.
Oh, how wonderful.
And Adam would host the show, and we got really good.
Oh, what a great guy. Password to me is just one of the greatest games that's ever been.
Well, see if you could whip out some of your old home games and get some people together and play it, because it does work on playing it on Zoom. And then what Adam would do is he would text the passwords, and that's how we could play it, so that the other the people that had a guess couldn't see them.
We tried this once. A friend of mine created a program by which he could send, wasn't a text, but he could send the word to somebody's device. We were playing Password for a fundraiser thing we were doing a couple of years ago. And I might leave this in, I might not, but maybe I'll leave it in. But he had, so one girl had the word and she was describing it to somebody else. And she gave her clue. She said, mistake. And the other player said, fault. And she and the second clue was human. And I'm looking at what the word is supposed to be. My friend is looking at what the word is supposed to be. It's not. She's not describing sandwich. She's describing the word error, because the program messed up and just gave her an error on her screen.
Yeah, we had a couple of those too, where somebody would read it wrong, and we had to throw it out. So yeah, I understand that dynamic.
Right. We didn't realize she's just describing the error screen that my friend's program was giving her.
Oh gosh. Oh.
Right. But
no,
fun times.
We tried a couple things. Adam Needham used to have a nightly game at the beginning of the pandemic, and he would find obscure board games and play them, and it was in case we're ever in lockdown again, that's a helpful hint for people that they could play games on Zoom.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Oh, I got through many a day in lockdown playing games on Zoom. I used to have little private parties, and I invite all my friends over and point my camera at the TV, and we'd play games together. Oh, it was so much fun.
Well, I hope we never have to do that again. But if you ever do get a game together again, count me in. I'm a
100%
total geek that way. I love it.
Awesome. You are officially on the list, Shelley.
Woohoo!
I want to talk about the National Archives of Game Show History. I mean, this is the reason why I'm doing this podcast right now. All of these conversations are being archived by the Strong Museum. And I, in addition to donating these recordings, also donated a set of cards from Card Sharks to the archive. What, if I may ask, does the Strong Museum have the privilege of gaining from you for that collection?
Well, I have donated some items from Supermarket Sweep. I did a version of that, the David Ruprecht version, the classic version.
The classic version. Were you a writer for that?
Yeah, I wrote for that too.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. But I want to tell you about a contribution that I facilitated, because sometimes my brain thinks before I probably should speak.
Sure.
But I call it putting my Lucy Ricardo thinking cap on.
Okay.
I had been acquainted with Betty White when I was working on Liars Club. In fact, there's a picture in my book, My Peacock Tale: Secrets of an NBC Page.
That's right.
There's a picture of me taken in the audience at Liars Club, sitting next to Betty White's mother, Tess. So, and it's so cute because they used to go to Elizabeth Arden together and get their hair done and get their nails polished the same. And then Betty would bring her to the studio, which I just thought was so marvelous that a daughter would think to do that for her mother, and the son-in-law was hosting the show. So I just thought that was a very sweet family dynamic that they had.
Absolutely.
So when Betty passed away, there was a photo that came up on social media of Betty and her assistant. And I reached out to the assistant and I said, I know you're going to have an auction for Betty's personal belongings. And when you get to the game show stuff and you think, who's going to want this junk? We do. So would you please consider making a donation to the museum? And, Betty will be suitably, and Alan Lutton will be suitably mentioned at the National Archive of Game Show History. Well, the assistant got back to me like in 2 weeks with this very generous list of items of things she found from Betty and Alan to donate to the museum. And one of the items was a book that Adam Needham wrote and gave to Betty as a gift. So Betty's estate returned it to Adam after it had been very lovingly gone through with, dog-eared pages. And you could tell Betty really enjoyed this book about she and Alan. And then at the very bottom of this email, her assistant said, "And would you like one of Betty's Emmys too?" So I was like, maybe. And no, I couldn't write back fast enough.
Sure.
And I said, oh my gosh, we would be so honored. And the Betty White estate has donated the Emmy that she won as Best Daytime Game Show Host for the show Just Men. And that is currently on display at the museum with a little note saying, "Coming soon, the National Archive of Game Show History." So if someone goes to the Strong Museum now to see many of the marvelous exhibits that they have there, they'll also see Betty's Emmy.
I was fortunate enough to see it a few months ago, and it is wondrous to see in person. The whole Strong Museum, it completely took me by surprise, just how enormous it was and how interactive it was, and just how creative it was. It was just that was my happy place. As somebody who loves games and game shows and puzzles, that was my absolute happy place.
How would you tell people to experience the museum? How much time should they plan to enjoy the museum?
Well, I'll tell you this. I got there at about 10 a.m. the day that we went, which was my birthday, it was May 9th. And we were there from 10 o'clock to 4 or 5. And a good portion of that, I was getting a tour of the sort of backstage area, the things that aren't on display yet. And we got to see the entire museum itself, the public-facing side. The 6-7 hours was not nearly enough time to experience the entire thing. We got to see a lot of it, but if you could take 3 or 4 days, get a hotel in the area, take as much time as you possibly can each of those days, maybe 3 or 4 days, it would take at least me to experience that entire thing, because it's enormous, like beyond comprehension. I mean, there's, you think you've seen everything, and then there's an entire other section of it's unbelievable.
What are some of the things that impressed you the most when you saw them?
Well, one of the first things I saw, and this is, again, sort of like the backstage kind of loading area, they had a massive collection of pinball machines. They had more of that type of machine that I've ever seen in person in my entire life, which is an unbelievable collection. The collection of board games that they have, because I'm huge into games, into board games. Just the thousands of games that they had, the shelves go like beyond my line of sight. I mean, it just kind of disappears into the horizon how long some of these game shelves are. But the public-facing side of the museum, the part that everybody will get to see if and when, hopefully when they visit, I loved the Sesame Street exhibit. There is something about seeing pieces of Sesame Street in person that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, that turned me into a kid again. I felt like a child, and my wife and I were exploring this area, and we're very play-centric people anyway. That's, laughter and play are huge parts of our lives on a daily basis, but the way that we were interacting, I felt, it's hard to describe. I felt like a child in the most positive and joyful way possible.
And from what I understand, what Chris has told me too, is that some of these exhibits are interactive.
A lot of them are. A lot of them are. Yeah, especially the Sesame Street. I mean, my wife counted with the count. It was unbelievable.
Oh,
Oh, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And again, just like the pure joy. I think to answer your question, what impressed me most was the amount of joy that was pouring out of everything. Everything was made with love and with appreciation for what that type of play brings to people. And it's just so contagious. You can't be upset at this place. You can't be upset at the Star Museum. It's just impossible.
and Adam Needham told me that he particularly liked the Mr. Rogers items.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Mr. Rogers stuff was unbelievable. Just again, just things that, I never thought I would see. There was a prototype Monopoly that was a big round board because the inventor had created it on his dining room table. There was the doll that the woman who founded the museum owned. It was like the first piece of that collection. Just so much stuff. I would recommend anybody to go.
Well, I understand the National Archive of Game Show History is slated to open in 2026. So I know that I'm going to be wearing my prettiest new dress to go to the opening. I hope everybody else does too.
Oh, absolutely. We will be there. That is going to be a celebration for our little world in a way that I don't think we've seen in a very long time. And that's not far away either. It sounds like it's a long way away, but that's just a couple of years from now. And I cannot wait.
No, with all the items that they need to catalog, and I know some of the items, specifically some things that Bob Bowden and Randy West have donated. They need a little TLC to get the electronics working again. So they need time to get that going too.
Sure. Oh, it's going to be so surreal to see some of that stuff in action. One of the things maybe I'll take this out, but I'll tell you anyway. One of the things I was able to see on my tour was the original contestant desk from Sale of the Century, which was so surreal to see in person.
Did you remember a woman on that show named Sally Julian? She was one of the prize girls.
Yeah, she was the first kind of co-host on that show. She wasn't. I think she got replaced by Lee Benning pretty early on.
When Sally and I used to do improv comedy together, and she would do the run-throughs for them. And Sally is very naturally like a Goldie Hawn type of ditzy blonde character. And they really wanted to try to do something different with displaying the items that were available that they could buy on Sale of the Century. So rather than just saying the normal copy that you would say, they brought her in to try to make it comedic and fun and light. And that didn't go over really well.
That's too bad. She was very fun. I enjoyed seeing her on Sale of the Century.
Yeah, no, she was a good friend and very talented too.
So, Shelley, in closing, I would love to hear how you feel about your time in that world of game shows. I know that your time in television extends way beyond just, game shows. I mean, you were involved in a lot of aspects of television production in those days. But I'd love to hear about the way you feel thinking about all those memories. I've had so many conversations with contestants, and one of the things that I found in common is that it's always fun to talk about these things. How do you feel reminiscing about all this stuff?
I feel privileged because I've been very lucky to be on both sides of the camera. So, I can see the process. I'm fascinated by the process. I love the idea of people having a game show experience as a contestant, and whether they win or lose, they have a great story to tell their grandchildren and their neighbors. So I love that aspect of it. I would hope that game shows would get less gimmicky and more to playing the game. I just am really tired of thinking we need to young it down, we need to dumb it down. I don't think people necessarily want things dumbed down. I think they do want to come away with feeling like when they've spent a half hour watching a show that they do come away with something, a little gem of knowledge perhaps, or, and just to be entertained. I think I learned a lot of life lessons working around game shows, how to get along in groups of people, especially in a stressful situation. There's the old expression, the show must go on. That was a producer who said that, not necessarily a writer or a director or a casting person, but we figure out a way to get the show to go on. And those are lessons I carry with me wherever I am.
Tell Us About Yourself. Conversations with Game Show Contestants is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Christian Carrion, from my studio in beautiful downtown Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. Co-executive producer Cory Anotado. Researcher Chuck Donegan. This has been a production of BuzzerBlog, the most popular game show website in the world, in partnership with the National Archives of Game Show History at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. For more information, visit museumofplay.org. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Christian Carrion. Good night. Tell Us About Yourself. Conversations with Game Show Contestants is produced in partnership with the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. One of the largest history museums in the United States, and one of the leading museums serving families with highly interactive exhibits and programs. Since 1968, the Strong Museum has been dedicated to exploring the ways in which play encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and how it illuminates cultural history. And their National Archives of Game Show History. Founded by industry veterans Bob Bowden and Howard Blumenthal, the archive is home to thousands of artifacts representing over 80 years of broadcasting, including props, set designs, video interviews with game show professionals, and other iconic elements from the history of television at play. For more information about the National Archives of Game Show History or the Strong National Museum of Play, visit museumofplay.org or call area code 585-263-2700. Tell Us About Yourself is sponsored by bonusround.ca, streaming Canada's classic game shows on demand. Dive into the golden age of television with thousands of episodes of Canadian series that defined an era from anywhere in the world, all for just $1.99 a month. From iconic shows like Let's Make a Deal and Definition to cult classics like Bumper Stumpers and The Mad Dash, bonusround.ca brings you timeless entertainment that's fun, enlightening, and affordable. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, relive the magic of Canadian television history. Subscribe now at bonusround.ca for $1.99 and turn every night into game show night. And by The Inn at Leola Village. Nestled in the heart of picturesque Pennsylvania, The Inn at Leola Village is a sanctuary of luxury and relaxation. Indulge in the timeless beauty of their historic suites, each meticulously designed to transport you to a bygone era of elegance and grace. Experience the culinary delights of their award-winning Italian restaurant, where every dish is a masterpiece crafted from the finest local ingredients. From romantic getaways to corporate retreats, the Inn at Leola Village offers a haven for every occasion. Unwind at the spa, stroll through the lush gardens, and let the stress of everyday life melt away. Make your reservation today at theinnatleolavillage.com or call the front desk at area code 717-656-7002. The Inn at Leola Village, an oasis of luxury.